Okay, so have you ever like agreed to something and then later you were like, wait a second. The information I based that agreement on like wasn't totally accurate.
Yeah, I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah, and like maybe it was something small, like, an apartment listing that promised like ample parking.
Right.
And then you move in and it's like a constant battle for a spot on the street.
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe it was like you bought something online, you saw these like amazing photos, and then when you got it, it was like, not quite what I was expecting. So today we're doing a deep dive into misrepresentation in contracts, because like that feeling of being misled, that's often where this area of law comes into play.
It really is. Think of misrepresentation in contract law kind of like your legal early warning system.
Yeah. Okay.
It kicks in when those statements or promises made before you sign on the dotted line. Well, they turn out to be not true, or maybe just seriously misleading. So today, we really want to make sure you understand, like, what actually qualifies as misrepresentation legally.
Okay.
And then the different ways it can happen. And probably most importantly, like, what are your options if you find yourself in a contract that's based on bad information?
I like it. Consider this your, fast track to understanding a super important part of the law that can come up in like all sorts of situations, right? From
Absolutely.
Renting an apartment to
It really can.
Much bigger agreements.
Huge agreements, yeah.
So to get us there, we've gone through like all the, legal stuff, the long explanations, and we've boiled it all down to the key things that you need to know.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. Misrepresentation in legal terms. It's basically a false or misleading statement of fact that happens during negotiations and that convinces you to enter into a contract.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's unpack that a little bit. What exactly do we mean by a statement of fact?
Okay, so it's more than just a straight up lie, right? It can also include statements that, while they might be technically true, they paint a really misleading picture.
Okay.
Right. So even a half-truth can be a misrepresentation.
Okay.
And then there's the question of silence. Generally, silence isn't considered a statement. But if someone actively hides information, or they only give you part of the truth in a way that's meant to deceive you,
right,
well, that can definitely be misrepresentation.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like, if a landlord just so happens to not mention the constant construction noise next door when you're viewing an apartment.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, that's silence.
It speaks volumes.
It's a statement in itself. Okay, so then what about opinions? Like,
Oh, that's a good one.
My uncle is always telling me, his latest whatever he bought is revolutionary.
Right.
Could that ever be considered misrepresentation?
So generally, statements of opinion aren't treated as statements of fact. We all have opinions.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets tricky. If the person giving the opinion has some special knowledge or expertise,
okay,
their opinion can actually be seen as a statement of fact.
Okay.
Because you're reasonably relying on their expertise.
Yeah.
It's not just a casual thought.
Right.
There's a case, actually, Smith v. Land and House Property Corp.
Okay.
And in that case, a landlord described a tenant who had some financial issues as most desirable.
Oh.
And the court said, hold on a second. That wasn't just an opinion.
Right.
Given the landlord's knowledge, that was actually a misrepresentation of fact.
Wow. Okay, so it's like if you have a seasoned real estate agent and they're telling me that a property is in excellent condition,
right,
but they know that there are like serious structural problems, that's not just their opinion.
That's more than an opinion at that point. Yeah.
Right. It's a statement.
It's a statement that they're expecting you to rely on.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. And then what about statements about the future?
Oh, yeah. Good point. So if someone says they plan to do something in the future, but they never actually had that intention, that's also a misrepresentation.
Okay.
It's a misrepresentation of their current state of mind.
Right.
There's a case, Edgington v. Fitzmaurice, and in that case, someone got a loan for business growth, but really they were planning to use it to pay off old debts.
Oh.
That's a misrepresentation of their present intention.
Interesting. Okay, so it's like they're saying they intend to do something when really they don't.
Exactly.
Got it. And then lastly, it's important to know that incorrect statements of law can actually now be considered false statements of fact.
Yeah, that's right. The legal understanding of this has evolved over time.
Interesting. Okay, so statement of fact, that's got a lot more nuance to it than I initially thought.
It does, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the essential elements that you, our listener, need to know to figure out if you might have been a victim of misrepresentation.
Okay, so there are 4 key elements that have to be present. The first is, and we've already talked about this, but a false statement of fact.
Right.
Second, that statement has to be made during negotiations.
Okay.
So it has to happen before the contract is finalized.
Right.
The third element is inducement.
Inducement.
This means that the false statement convinced you to enter into the agreement. It could have been part of the reason or the whole reason.
Okay.
So you knew about the statement it was meant for you to rely on, and you actually did rely on it when you made your decision.
Okay, so if someone makes a false claim, but I never even heard it, or I just completely ignored it and I signed the contract for completely different reasons, that wouldn't be misrepresentation?
That's right. There has to be a direct connection between the false statement and your decision to enter into the contract.
Okay.
There's a case, Horsfall v. Thomas, and in this case, a gun had a hidden defect.
Okay.
But the buyer never actually examined the gun before buying it. So the court said, well, the concealed defect didn't actually induce him to buy the gun. So the takeaway is you have to have relied on the false statement for it to be misrepresentation.
Got it. Okay, and what's the fourth element?
So the fourth element is addressee. The misrepresentation has to be made by the other party to the contract or their agent, and it has to be made directly to you.
Okay.
So if you happen to overhear a false statement that they made to someone else, that wouldn't usually count as misrepresentation in your contract.
Got it. Okay, so this is all starting to
Yeah.
create a clear picture in my mind.
Yeah.
Now, something that I thought was really interesting in the sources is the difference between a representation and a contract term.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction.
Why is that so important for our listeners to understand?
Okay, so a statement made before you sign a contract, it can basically go one of two ways.
Mm-hmm.
It can stay a representation. So a statement that just encourages you to enter the agreement.
Okay.
Or it can actually become a term of the contract itself, a written term within the contract.
Okay.
Now, if a statement becomes a term of the contract and it turns out to be false, that's a breach of contract.
Okay.
But if it stays a representation and it's false, that's misrepresentation, and the remedies for those two things are different.
Okay, so let me see if I got this straight. So if my lease agreement says newly installed appliances,
Right.
and I move in and the appliances are ancient, that's a breach of contract.
Exactly.
But if the landlord told me before I signed the lease that all the appliances were brand new, and that was a major reason why I rented the place, that's misrepresentation.
Exactly. That's a great example.
Yeah.
So in the first case with the lease agreement, the remedy would be a breach of contract claim.
Okay.
You might be able to get the appliances replaced or something like that.
Right.
But in the second case, with the verbal statement before you sign the lease, that would fall under misrepresentation, and you might actually have grounds to end the lease altogether.
Oh, wow. Okay, so different legal paths with different potential outcomes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so let's move into the different types of misrepresentation. So our sources talk about fraudulent, negligent, and innocent misrepresentation. So it sounds like we're getting into the head of the person who made the false statement now.
We are. Yeah. The law categorizes misrepresentation based on what the person making the statement knew or believed when they said it.
Okay.
So let's start with fraudulent misrepresentation.
Okay.
This is the most serious type. It means the person making the statement knew it was false. They didn't believe it was true, or they didn't care if it was true or false, and they said it to trick you into signing the contract.
Wow. Okay.
So proving this intent to deceive is super important for fraudulent misrepresentation.
Okay.
And a famous case, Dairy v. Peak, that established this high bar for proving fraud, you really have to show that they knew it was false or that they didn't care about the truth. And if you can prove fraudulent misrepresentation, the consequences for the person who made the statement can be pretty serious.
Yeah, so let me just make sure I'm following. So if a used car salesman tells me that a car has a brand new engine, even though they know it's the original engine, and it has 200,000 miles on it, that would be fraudulent misrepresentation.
Yeah, that's a really clear example. They know it's false, and they're saying it to get you to buy the car.
Okay. Okay, got it. So then what about negligent misrepresentation?
Okay, so negligent misrepresentation, this is when the person honestly believed that what they were saying was true, but they didn't have a good reason for that belief.
Okay.
So it's about carelessness or a failure to do their due diligence.
Oh, okay.
And there's a case, Esso Petroleum Co. Ltd v. Martin,
Okay.
that basically says if you have special knowledge or expertise, you have a responsibility to be careful about the statements you make during negotiations.
So is it like if that same real estate agent tells me that the property line goes like 5 feet beyond the fence, even though like the survey clearly shows that it doesn't,
Right.
and they never bothered to check the survey before telling me that, and then it turns out to be wrong, would that be negligent misrepresentation?
Yeah, that's a good example. They had a belief, but they didn't take reasonable steps to make sure it was accurate.
Okay,
So that's negligent misrepresentation.
got it. And then lastly, we have innocent misrepresentation.
Right. So innocent misrepresentation, this is when the person genuinely believed what they were saying was true, and they had a reasonable basis for believing it, but it turns out it was still false.
Okay.
So there's no intention to deceive, and there's no carelessness. They just got it wrong.
So like maybe the seller of a house truly believed that the roof was only 5 years old because that's what the previous owner told them.
Right.
And they had no reason to doubt that. But then it turns out the roof is actually like way older.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
Would that be innocent?
There'll be innocent misrepresentation.
Okay.
They had an honest belief and a good reason for it, but the information was wrong.
Got it. Okay. So we've got fraudulent, we've got negligent, we've got innocent. Understanding those different types is really important because it affects what you can actually do about it.
It does. Yeah, it affects the remedies that are available to you.
Okay, so let's talk about remedies. If you find yourself in a situation where you've been misrepresented to, what are your options?
Okay.
Our sources point to 2 main remedies, rescission and damages. So let's start with rescission.
Okay.
What does that actually mean for you practically?
Okay, so rescission basically means undoing the contract.
Really?
It makes the contract voidable, which means you have the option to cancel it.
Okay.
And if you cancel it, you get put back in the position you were in before you ever signed the contract.
Right.
So you're basically hitting the rewind button.
I like it.
And the legal term for that is restitutio in integram. It means restoring things to their original condition.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that rescission isn't automatic.
Okay.
You have to take steps to make it happen.
Okay, so it sounds like a pretty powerful tool, but are there any limitations? Can you always just cancel a contract if there was misrepresentation?
So there are some limitations. They're often called bars to rescission.
Bars to rescission.
Yeah, one of them is affirmation. So if you find out about the misrepresentation, but you continue to act like you're going to go ahead with the contract, like you keep making payments or using the product, you might lose your right to rescind.
Okay.
And there's a case that shows this, Long v. Lloyd.
Oh, okay. What if you don't discover the misrepresentation until like a long time has passed?
Yeah, so lapse of time can also prevent rescission if you wait too long, especially if the value of what you contracted for has changed a lot. A court might say it's too late, and that's especially true for innocent misrepresentation.
Okay.
Another bar is if restitutio in integram is impossible.
Okay, so we're talking about that rewind button.
We are, yeah. So this means it's just not practically possible to put everyone back to where they were before the contract.
Right.
Like, for example, if you bought a perishable good and you ate it, you can't really give it back.
Right. You can't uneat it.
Exactly. And there's a case that shows Clark v. Dixon, but there's another case, Demolestein v. Ponton, that suggests partial rescission might be possible.
Okay.
So if the contract can be divided up, you might be able to undo part of it.
Okay, interesting. So, like, if I bought a car based on a misrepresentation and I drove it for a year and then I found out the truth rescission might not be an option because I can't return the car in its original condition.
Right. That's a likely scenario. Yeah.
Got it. And then what about the last bar?
So the last one is third-party rights. If someone else has acquired rights related to the contract, your ability to cancel the original contract might be limited.
Okay.
Like if the person who misrepresented something to you, then it sold the item to an innocent third party.
Okay, so you're protected.
Yeah, you're protecting that third party.
That third party, got it. Okay, so rescission, not always a slam dunk.
Not always.
Okay, let's talk about damages then.
Okay.
So that's getting money, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, getting financial compensation.
Okay, so how do damages work with those different types of misrepresentation?
So damages are handled differently depending on the type of misrepresentation, whether it was fraudulent, negligent, or innocent.
Okay.
So let's start with fraudulent misrepresentation.
Okay.
If you can prove fraud, you can sue for all the losses you suffered as a result of the fraud, even if those losses weren't foreseeable.
Okay.
So that's a key point. You're not limited to just the losses that were predictable.
Right.
This is based on the idea of deceit. And there are some cases that support this broad approach to damages, like Doyle v. Olby, Ironmongers, LTD, and Roy Scott Trust v. Rogerson.
Okay.
So the goal is to fully compensate you for the harm caused by the intentional deception.
Okay, so in cases of fraud, the person who lied could be on the hook for like a lot more than in other situations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, what about negligent misrepresentation?
Okay, so for negligent misrepresentation, the Misrepresentation Act in some places allows you to get damages as if the misrepresentation was fraudulent,
Okay.
unless the person who made the statement can prove they had a good reason to believe it was true. The usual goal here is to put you in the financial position you would have been in if the misrepresentation hadn't happened. So these are called reliance damages.
Reliance damages.
And sometimes the court might award damages instead of rescission for negligent misrepresentation.
Got it. Okay, and then what about innocent misrepresentation?
So for innocent misrepresentation, the main remedy is usually rescission. Damages aren't typically available under common law. But again, in some places under the Misrepresentation Act, the court might be able to award damages instead of rescission if rescission would be really unfair.
Okay, so like they have some...
Yeah, they have some discretion there.
Got it. Okay, this is a lot of information, but super helpful.
Yeah.
Let's go back to some of those like big picture considerations for our listeners.
Okay.
We talked about statements of opinion and future intention earlier, but it seems like there's more to it than that.
Yeah, so just remember that while they're not usually considered, statements of fact, both opinions and future intentions can become misrepresentations in certain situations.
Right.
Like if the person expressing the opinion doesn't actually hold that opinion, or if they never intended to do what they said they would do in the future.
Right, right. Okay, and then what about that concept of materiality?
Yeah.
How important is it that the false statement was actually like significant?
So materiality is generally really important for negligent and innocent misrepresentation.
Okay.
The false statement usually has to be something that would influence a reasonable person's decision to enter the contract.
Okay.
But for fraudulent misrepresentation, the fact that someone lied to get you into the contract can sometimes be enough, even if the lie was about something small.
Right, because like
Yeah,
if they're lying about the small things, they're probably lying about the big things.
exactly. And the law is much harsher on intentional deception.
Right, right. That makes sense. Okay, and then there's that term justifiable reliance. What does that mean for me as a listener?
So justifiable reliance means that your decision to rely on the statement needs to be reasonable under the circumstances. The courts will look at things like your expertise, whether the falsehood was obvious and whether you had a chance to check the information yourself.
Right.
There's a case, Atwood v. Small, that shows that if you do your own investigation and you rely on that instead of the other party's statement, that might weaken your claim of misrepresentation.
Okay, so it's like if I'm buying a used boat and the seller says, oh yeah, the engine is perfect, but then I hire my own mechanic to look at it and they give me a report that says like, oh no, this engine is a disaster.
Right.
And then I still buy the boat. Can I later claim misrepresentation?
Probably not. In that case, you relied on your own expert's assessment, not just the seller's statement.
Got it. Okay. And then lastly, what about those exclusion clauses? Can contracts just say, like, we're not responsible for anything we said before you sign this?
So contracts a lot of times do try to limit or exclude liability for misrepresentation, but the courts are very careful about those clauses.
Okay.
And they're often not effective, especially for fraudulent misrepresentation. The law doesn't really like it when someone lies to get you into a contract and then tries to hide behind a clause.
Right. Right.
And even clauses that try to exclude liability for negligent or innocent misrepresentation, they're still subject to tests of reasonableness and clarity.
Okay. So you can't just like
Yeah, you can't just
get out of it that easily.
Exactly.
Okay. This has been a really interesting deep dive into misrepresentation.
It has been.
Let's bring it back to some real world scenarios that might be relevant to our listeners.
Okay.
So thinking about renting a property in California,
Okay.
especially in like Orange County, Riverside, San Diego, Los Angeles.
Right. In those areas, if a landlord or their agent says there are no problems with pests or leaks or anything like that,
Yeah.
but then you move in and there are huge problems that could be misrepresentation.
Okay.
And then in real estate transactions in California, if a seller doesn't tell you about important defects like unpermitted additions or foundation issues,
Right.
that could also be misrepresentation.
And if you're in California and you have concerns about this stuff.
Yeah, if you're in those areas, you mentioned Orange County, Riverside, San Diego, Los Angeles.
Yeah.
MartinezLawCenter.com
Yeah.
is a good resource to check out.
Okay.
They specialize in tenant rights and real estate.
Perfect. And it's really important to remember that misrepresentation is a separate claim from breach of contract.
That's right.
Misrepresentation is about false statements that get you to sign the contract.
Exactly.
Breach of contract is about breaking the terms of the contract after you've already signed it.
Exactly. Yeah. Great distinction.
So just to quickly recap some key takeaways for our listeners.
Yeah.
Misrepresentation. It happens when a false statement of fact made during negotiations convinces you to sign a contract.
Right.
Understanding whether that misrepresentation was fraudulent, negligent, or innocent is super important.
It is.
Because it affects what remedies you might have available.
It does.
Primarily the option to cancel the contract, which is rescission,
Right.
or seek financial compensation, which is damages. And always be thinking about what legally constitutes a statement of fact. The fact that the statement has to have influenced your decision to sign the contract.
Right. Inducement.
Inducement.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that your reliance on that statement has to be justifiable.
Justifiable reliance. Yeah. And don't forget those limitations on your ability to cancel a contract.
The bars to rescission.
Yeah, bars to rescission. Exactly.
Okay. So as we wrap up here,
Yeah.
think about this. Anytime you're entering into an agreement,
Yeah.
the accuracy of the information that you're relying on, it really matters.
It really does.
If something feels off or too good to be true,
Absolutely.
dig a little deeper.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, could this be misrepresentation, and what can I do to protect myself?
Those are great questions to ask.
Before I sign on that dotted line,
Absolutely.
that's a really important point to remember.
It is.
This deep dive has given us like a great foundational understanding of misrepresentation.
It is. Yeah.
But as we've talked about contract law, especially this area, it can be complex, and it really depends on the specific facts of each situation.
It really does.
So if you think that you might have been induced into a contract by misrepresentation, getting legal advice is essential
It is so important.
to understand your specific rights and options.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.